Welcome, everyone. I'm Melissa Deckman. I'm the CEO of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar that's going to discuss our newly released report, Resistance to Christian Nationalism in All 50 States. This is a co-branded report, a collaboration with the Meanings of Democracy Lab from the University of Connecticut. It's my pleasure to introduce very briefly our panelists for today's conversation. We're delighted to welcome Michael Fisher. He is an assistant professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. He is also a PRRI Public Fellow this year. We're also delighted to welcome the Reverend Jim Wallace, who is the director of the Georgetown University Center on Faith and Justice. My colleague, Robbie Jones, president and founder of PRRI, is also joining us today. And last but not least is Ruthie Bronstein. Ruth Bronstein is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Connecticut and the Director of the Meanings of Democracy Lab. And I'm going to do a brief overview of some of her findings in a few minutes, but I wanted to turn the floor over to Ruth because really she's our partner in crime with this study. She is the brainchild behind the development of this report, and we work very closely with her on it. So Ruth, please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. So for the past year, through my lab, the Meanings of Democracy Lab, I've led a project on resistance to Christian nationalism. As people espousing Christian nationalist ideas have become more explicit about their goals, this has made Christian nationalism more visible to members of the public. And as more people have been able to assign a term to the divisive rhetoric and policies that they've seen take hold of their communities, many of these people are taking action to push back. Some do this individually, and some have formed new organizations or campaigns to educate others about what they view as the dangers of Christian nationalism for their communities, for American democracy, and even for American Christianity. So though Christian nationalism has been a topic of debate this election season especially, this isn't a fight that hinges on one election. As one conservative evangelical Christian leader of one of these organizations told me, he views resistance to white Christian nationalism as a generational project. It's also not a partisan fight. The people leading this resistance come from both major political parties, as well as every major faith tradition, including, yes, small numbers of white evangelical Christians. This is why I call this emerging field the pluralist resistance to Christian nationalism. Though this extremely diverse set of Americans resist different aspects of Christian nationalism for varied reasons and in different ways, they tend to share one thing in common, and that's a commitment to pluralism. Basically, the idea that the United States' racial, ethnic, and religious heritage and diversity is a strength rather than a weakness, and that the diverse peoples who make up a society, and not just one single group, should have a hand in shaping the society and its laws. I also revert to this field of resistance as pluralistic because the diversity of the individuals and the organizations that are working to resist Christian nationalism, as we'll see, can prove a challenge for movement building. But as people are increasingly working together across religious, racial, and partisan lines, I think that they're modeling a kind of pluralism in action. Which brings me to this report. In February of this year, PRRI released its report, Support for Christian Nationalism in All 50 States. And it really was a huge report. I was amazed by the depth and the breadth of the data, and particularly the ability to visualize variation in Christian nationalist attitudes across all 50 states at the state level. I thought of many of the organizations I've been tracking who are often working at the local and state levels to build coalitions of what some call strange bedfellows, in order to resist Christian nationalist policies and rhetoric. It occurred to me that if we flipped the data from that report on its head and focused not on those most attracted to Christian nationalist ideas, but those most resistant to them, the resulting data could be quite practically useful to many of those folks on the ground. More generally, though, the data illuminates, I think in very helpful ways, variation in the extent to which different groups of Americans resist Christian nationalist ideas, meaning who outright rejects those ideas and who's skeptical. And finally, it underscores the fact that there are many people of faith, especially those who are not white or not Christian, but also some white Christians who are quite opposed to Christian nationalism. I'm very grateful to PRRI and the team for partnering with me and my lab on this report, and to all of you for tuning in today. We'll kick things off with a discussion of some of the main findings from the report, led by Melissa Deckman, and then we'll turn to a discussion with our esteemed panelists. Finally, we'll be collecting questions from the audience throughout the webinar, and we'll aim to answer a couple of those before we're done today, so feel free to submit those as we go. And with that, I'll hand things off to Melissa Deckman, who will preview some of the main findings of the report.
Thank you very much, Ruthie. And please, I encourage those of you who are listening, download the report, read it. There's a lot more information and a lot more analysis in the report. And please send it to folks that you know. I think it's a really important study. So let's start with a little bit about the methodology of our survey. As Ruthie noted, earlier this year in February, we released a major study on Americans' attitudes with respect to Christian nationalism, and we mapped in all 50 states the propensity of state citizens to adhere to Christian nationalist views. We were able to do that because this is a very unique data set that has more than 20,000 interviews. And this data was collected last year from March through December using Ipsos Knowledge Panel. Because of the very large sample size, the margin of error for the full sample is less than 0.1%, plus or minus 1 percentage points there. And I also just have to acknowledge that the survey report here, the data collected was made possible through the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation, the Foundation for Open Society, the Glenn Family Foundation, and the Unitarian Universalist Beach Program at Shelter Rock. All right, I want to just take a step back first and tell you and tell the audience how we're actually measuring Christian nationalism. And so our guide here is that we have compiled a scale based on not one question's responses, but on the responses to 5 separate statements. And we ask Americans the extent to which they completely agree, mostly disagree, or completely disagree with the following here. And so here are the questions that we use in this very rigorous and statistically tested scale. Do you agree that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society? That the US government should declare America a Christian nation? That being Christian is an important part of being truly American? If the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country any longer, and that US laws should be based on Christian values. As you'll see on the right, there's some variance with respect to how Americans answer this question, but in no question do we find that a majority, or even close to a majority of Americans agree. In fact, most Americans are more likely to disagree with a lot of these statements, including 3 in 4 Americans who disagree that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society. So we package that all together, and essentially we break the data into 4 groups. And so if you look on the next slide, this is essentially the breakdown of Americans with respect to their attitudes toward Christian nationalism. We find that 1 in 10 Americans we classify as Christian nationalist adherents. And so those Americans essentially strongly agree with the aforementioned statements that you saw before. We find an additional 20% of Americans are largely sympathetic to the views that you saw on the previous page. Now, they might not completely agree with every statement, but they mostly agree with most of those statements. Again, so now you're seeing about 3 in 10 Americans are who we classify as Christian nationalism adherents and or sympathizers. We're going to be looking more closely today at the folks who are in the green part of this pie chart, right? So we're looking at Americans who are skeptical of Christian nationalism. And so those Americans mostly disagree with the statements you saw before. And about 30% of Americans outright completely disagree with the statements that you saw before. And combined, this group of Americans is almost 7 in 10 Americans who really are rejecting Christian nationalist views. So again, one of the benefits of this report with such a large data sample size is that we're able to map these ideas, these viewpoints through all 50 states. And in February, our map showed a heat map of Americans who were adhering to Christian nationalist views. And here we're looking at a map that shows the resistance, combining both the rejectors and the skeptics among all Americans by state. And I think there's a couple of notable takeaways here, and I'm sure the panelists will want to talk about this more as we get going. But of course, if you see the dark blue states are those that have the highest rates of resistance among state citizens. The lighter the green color gets, the more acceptance you have there. But really, if you noted this map, In only 2 states do we find that there's a minority of citizens, 46% in Mississippi and 48% in West Virginia, who essentially agree with kind of the resistance to Christian nationalism here. Instead, we find that majorities in all states, and very strong majorities, especially on the West Coast and on the East Coast, that you're seeing such resistance to Christian nationalism. With respect to the election next week, we're hearing a lot about battleground states. And I think the data here on Christian nationalism resistance is really interesting, because if you look at a state like Arizona and Nevada, which is getting a lot of attention, we find very strong majorities of those states' residents actually resist Christian nationalism. Whereas in states like Georgia and North Carolina, which have larger percentages of African Americans who are very religious, and as we'll see here, there's some interesting racial dynamics happening with respect to Christian nationalism. Resistance to Christian nationalism isn't quite as high. But I think, again, a big takeaway here is that in no state except for 2 are we finding that state residents are really rejecting, or that they're adhering to Christian nationalist belief. In fact, they're more likely to resist Christian nationalist views. And so kind of collapsing those groups together into those blue states, red states, and battleground states, we find that majorities in each of these states are rejecting Christian nationalism. They're part of that kind of resistance in terms of their attitudes here. And in blue states, of course, we find the most resistance. We find here that nearly, more than 75%, roughly 75% of residents in those states we would classify as Christian nationalist resistors. Not quite as high in the battleground states, but still a strong majority. But even in the red states, we find that 6 in 10 red state residents are not subscribing to the views of Christian nationalism. And then we also had a plot that we decided to include in this report. Now, back in February, we were plotting and showing a relationship between scores on Christian nationalism, support for Christian nationalism, and percent of voting for Trump. And as you can imagine, when we flip that, we find that the more that a state's residents are resistant to Christian nationalism, the more likely that state voted for Joe Biden. I used to teach statistics when I was a full-time college professor, and this is a great textbook example of what a positive correlation looks like between two concepts here. All right, so who is likely to make up Christian resistors here? And so here we're going to take a little bit of a dive into some of the demographic and religious components of the Christian nationalist resistance. So we don't have room on here to show, but we did take a look at the gender breakdowns. There's no gender divide when it comes to Christian nationalist resistance. Men and women are equally likely to resist Christian nationalism views. We do find an age divide, kind of echoing what Ruthie said earlier about this generational approach. Essentially, Christian nationalism is most, I think, appealing to older Americans. We find that Gen Z and millennials tend to be the least supportive of Christian nationalism. But along racial lines, there's an interesting story here. We find that Asian American Pacific Islanders are the most strongly opposed to Christian nationalism. We also find in other studies here at PRRI that AAPI Americans tend to be the least religious, or they are more likely to subscribe to minority faiths. So I don't think that's at all surprising. But in the other groups, we're not finding necessarily lots of differences looking at race per se. But there is a clear relationship between educational attainment and Christian nationalist resistance here. So you can see from the bottom chart that the higher a degree that a person has, the more likely they are to resist Christian nationalism. And let's take a look now at some of the partisan angles of Christian nationalism here. So we find, not surprisingly, that among Democrats, there's far more resistance to Christian nationalism. In fact, we're finding well over 80% of Democrats are rejectors or skeptics. Independents look more like Democrats when it comes to Christian nationalist resistance, although not quite as high levels. Notably, though, if you look at among Republicans, so we find that a majority of Republicans we classify as sympathizers or adherents based upon their responses to the questions before, but it's really not a strong, solid, overwhelming majority, right? In fact, we find that 43% of Republicans can be characterized as rejectors, or mainly in the skeptics bucket here. And then, of course, not surprisingly, we find similar breaks when it comes to American views on Biden and Trump. So of course, last year we were asking about Joe Biden throughout 2023. And so if you have a favorable view of Joe Biden, you're far more likely to be a Christian nationalist, rejecter, or skeptic. Whereas if you have favorable views of Trump, you're a lot less likely to be resistant. But again, even among Americans who have a favorable view of Trump, we find that 43% roughly are those who we classify as being a Christian nationalist resistor. Kind of breaking into that group a little bit more in more detail, here's a chart that looks just at Americans who are resistant. So that group of skeptics and rejectors together. And we find among those Americans who are rejectors, resistors, 42% have a favorable view of Biden, and about 33% have a favorable view of Donald Trump. That's among the American public, I'm sorry. But if you look at resistors, resistors are more than twice as likely to have a favorable view of Donald Trump than they do of Joe Biden than they do of Donald Trump, sorry. But again, the partisan breaks here are not at all that surprising. Among Democrats who are resistant to Christian nationalism, 83% have a favorable view of Joe Biden, just 5% have a favorable view of Donald Trump. Independents are really more split in terms of independent resistors have more favorable views of Joe Biden than Donald Trump. But notably, I think this is really important. Even though we find that there are quite a lot of Republicans who are resistant to Christian nationalism, they're still Republicans. And so a majority of them, 61%, have favorable views of Donald Trump. And although it's not in this table, if you look at our February report, we found that among Republicans who are Christian nationalist adherent, or they are more espoused to Christian nationalist views, it goes up to 80%. So those who are Christian nationalists and are Republicans, they do have even more favorable views of Donald Trump. But still, many Republicans, even if they reject the tenets of Christian nationalism, are still more likely to say that they view Donald Trump favorably. And next, we're going to look at religion and Christian nationalism resistance. And so looking at religious tradition, we find, probably not surprisingly, that the Americans most likely to resist Christian nationalism come from minority religious traditions or are religiously unaffiliated. So American Jews and those who are religiously unaffiliated, we find more than 9 in 10 reject the tenets of Christian nationalism. We also find similar levels of support for Christian nationalism resistance among Americans who come from another non-religious tradition. Notably, we look at Catholics. There's an interesting divide here. Hispanic Catholics are slightly more likely than white Catholics to oppose, to be supportive for Christian nationalism resistance. But if we look at white Christians overall, we see white Catholics, we see white mainline non-evangelical Protestants, and we look at white evangelicals. We find here there is definitely a divide. White evangelicals are the group least likely to be resistant to Christian nationalism. This is really a shock if you read our other work here at PRRI or read our earlier study. But even among, though, white Catholics and white mainliners, there's more of a tendency to reject the ideas of Christian nationalism, really quite profoundly. And I think that's really an important point to kind of think about. And finally, on Hispanic Protestants, we find in our research that Hispanic Protestants tend to be more evangelical. And so they're the group that's the second most likely to be supportive of Christian nationalism overall. But this gives you, again, sort of a religious snapshot of the Christian nationalist resistance. So I would say one big takeaway from this chart is that most people of faith, in fact, are not supportive of Christian nationalism. Then we took a deeper dive into the religious behaviors of Americans by their views on Christian nationalism. And so I think what's notable about this chart is that it should come as no surprise that Americans who are adherent to or sympathetic to Christian nationalism exhibit much more highly religious behaviors. And so here we're looking at a graph that shows the percentage of Americans who pray at least once a week, read the Bible once a week, or attend religious services weekly. Again, in the blue graphs you see here in the blue charts, bar graphs, you see that strong percentages of Christian nationalist sympathizer and adherents they're very religious compared to Americans overall. But that's not the same thing as saying that people who are rejecting or skeptical of Christian nationalism are irreligious. We see the lowest levels of religious behavior by those who completely reject Christian nationalism. And you'll see in our survey report, if you look at the breakdown of Christian nationalist rejectors, there's a very, very big component that are made up of religiously unaffiliated. So we're not surprised to see a lack of less religious behavior. But among those who are skeptical, about half of those Americans pray at least once a week. 20% read the Bible, 23% attend religious services, which is really very much along the lines of who we see in the American public in terms of their overall rates of these religious behaviors. So it is not necessarily an irreligious movement, I think. Finally, we have a couple of slides with respect to the political worldviews of Christian nationalists and resistors. So we asked Americans about, we routinely ask Americans about sort of the apocalyptic thinking and political violence here. And so we chose two slides or two questions to profile in this last part of the presentation. So we've asked Americans the extent to which they agree that a storm is coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. And we've also asked about political violence, this idea that because things have gotten so far off track, that true American patriots may have to resort to political violence. In our February report and in other reports, we have clearly talked about one really big threat to our democracy is that Christian nationalist adherents are far more prone to accept and find political violence acceptable. And we see that really playing out here. And they also are more prone to apocalyptic thinking that might lead the groundworks to justifying why political violence is necessary here. And so when you look at Christian nationalists who are rejectors and skeptics, we're seeing far less of a propensity to have those sorts of viewpoints. Christian resistors are rejecting those notions by and large. And our final slide, we actually, again, decided to dig down a little bit deeper into the resistors in our survey. And so here we're combining both those who reject and are skeptical of Christian nationalism from before. And so we find, for example, among all Christian nationalism resistors, only about 15% agree that there's a storm coming that will sweep away elites in power. And only about 13% agree that because things have gotten so far track, American patriots will have to resort to violence. Notably, though, those viewpoints are really largely similar among partisan lines here. And I wanted just to kind of take a look at the Republican line here and to think about that earlier slide that we showed. So among Republicans who resist Christian nationalism, they're less likely to think that political violence is necessary or desirable or ever justified. But yet we know from earlier data that I showed you that Republicans who are resistors are still favorably inclined toward Donald Trump. I think that's an interesting note to end on and to hear other people's thoughts about our findings from the survey. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. And I think that there's so much that we can take away from that report. And I always like to think about how this data travels in the world. And I think that for social scientists, there is a strong interest for us in sort of identifying really large-scale trends and patterns. And the large-scale trends and patterns about support for Christian nationalism are, I think, really clear. But when you think about the kind of politics of coalition building and movement building, that's often about finding small pockets of often countercultural views within communities. And so in this case, who's resisting Christian nationalism, even within communities that we might think of as largely supportive of Christian nationalism, and where new conversations kind of happening that are potentially moving the needle on those. And so I think that this report helps us to see both of those, and your description of it, I think, is really helpful and hopefully will be useful for lots of people. And so I just wanted to pull out kind of three big themes that maybe we can talk through in our panel. And one of those is that, as we saw, the single largest kind of group of Americans who resist Christian nationalism are non-religious, and that's followed by non-Christian groups. And I think just to put that into context, those groups have also historically made up the base of organized efforts to promote church-state separation and religious pluralism more generally. But I also think it's noteworthy that a disproportionate share, or I'm sorry, that many of the white Christian groups that show up in the resistant category for us are highly skeptical of Christian nationalism. They don't show up as outright rejecting Christian nationalism, but they are very skeptical. And of these Latter-day Saints, are most skeptical. Around half of Latter-day Saints are skeptical of Christian nationalism, followed by Hispanic Catholics, other Catholics of color, white mainline and non-evangelical Protestants, white Catholics, and Black Protestants. And so, right, there's something I think interesting about the delineation there between outright rejection and that skepticism that might be meaningful for people looking to have conversations in those communities. Similarly, I think that there's a couple of outlier states where Christian nationalism attitudes really set a couple of red states apart from other red states. And, Utah is one of those, as is Alaska. These are red states with high levels of resistance to Christian nationalism. And the Utah example aligns, I think, well with the fact that Latter-day Saints are overwhelmingly skeptical of Christian nationalism. And so I think that as people are watching what's happening electorally in those states, this could end up being a significant issue. And then finally, and you really highlighted this, that we know that there's a clear positive relationship between religiosity and support for Christian nationalism, but it doesn't mean that Christian nationalists kind of have a monopoly on faith. And that's especially true among non-white Americans. And so, I think that the data that PRRI has put out for a long time have shown that the symbolic link between religion and right-wing politics has often been a self-fulfilling prophecy, as liberals and moderates have potentially left religious communities because of concerns about the politics of religion. But I think that some of the work on the ground being done to resist Christian nationalism is making more visible the fact that many people of faith are quite religious and also quite resistant or skeptical of Christian nationalism. So I think those are some of our big pull-out takeaways in my view that I'd love to talk more about. And with that, I have a couple of questions just to kick things off for our panelists. And we can see where the conversation goes. So Robbie, I'll start with you, if that's okay. One of the data points from a previous PRRI report on Christian nationalism that really stuck with me is that Americans who have heard of Christian nationalism are twice as likely to hold a negative than a positive view of the term. And as some activists I follow put it, resistance involves 3 steps: see it, name it, fight it. And historians, sociologists, and survey researchers, including PRRI, have played a central role in the name it part of that equation. It can sometimes feel uncomfortable for scholars to become public actors in this way. But as one of those scholars who's found themselves at the center of those public conversations about the dangers of Christian nationalism, how do you understand the role, the relationship between education about Christian nationalism and resistance to it?
Yeah, well, thank you. So it is fun to see, a previous report kind of flipped around on its head. So thank you, Ruthie, for kind of taking the lead on, making us kind of look, at the same data just through a different lens. And you do begin to see, different things. And I just want to reiterate one thing that, was said right up at the beginning that you said, Ruthie, and that is that, this is not really a partisan issue, what we're talking about here. Christian nationalism at its heart is antithetical to a pluralistic democracy. So this is something that is a worldview that's really not compatible with a pluralistic democracy. We had those 5 statements at the very beginning about Christians exercising dominion over others. But when you boil it all down, or U.S. law should be based on the Bible, it really is this idea that of who this country is of, by, and for, right? And the Christian nationalist claim is that this country is of, by, and for Christians, and specifically Christians of European descent, if you look at the way this is historically developed. And of course, that is just fundamentally incompatible. So, as a scholar, I think it is challenging sometimes, especially when something is so, out there and at the forefront of our politics, which are partisan. But at the end of the day, this itself is not really a partisan issue. And I think that's been one thing, at least as a scholar, that I felt freer to talk about it, as a threat to democracy, and that actually feels like the responsibility of people doing public scholarship. And we can talk about this later, but I have joined up with 3 other scholars, Kristen Dumais, Jamar Tisby, and Diana Butler Bass, and we've been kind of doing a little speaking tour on the kind of threats to this. One other thing I'll say too, just because you mentioned the term Christian nationalism, and I've been pretty fascinated by the fact that, we've been asking about this for a while, and we can actually see in the data that more and more Americans actually know this term. So when we asked about whether people knew this term the first time we surveyed on it, it was about 4 in 10 Americans who said they hadn't heard of the term. But today, our most recent data has got that's only down to about a quarter of Americans that haven't heard of it overall. And then one of the interesting things about it is that overall Americans have a more negative than favorable view of the term. But when we break that down by people who are supportive of the fundamental tenets of Christian nationalism, we see something very interesting. And that is that we actually see that Christian nationalism adherents are, and Christian nationalism skeptics as well, both of whom have majority favorable views of the term. Right. So it's the case that as the country's hearing more about it, people who qualify as Christian nationalists by their views actually are embracing the term. And at the same time, Christian nationalism skeptics and rejectors are rejecting the term. One, I think, at least kind of pragmatic thing that means is that, it's not a term that like one side is using to beat up on the other. So it's actually a term that is sociologists and journalists and others can actually use in the public debate because it's actually being understood, I think, similarly by both sides of the debate.
The movement in that data is, I think, really instructive and fascinating. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Thanks, Robbie. I'm going to go to Jim next. So, Jim, you recently wrote a book called The False White Gospel: Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. And your organization, the Georgetown Center on Faith and Justice, recently held a summit called Test of Faith that called Christian leaders to confront Christian nationalism. Could you tell us about the statement that came out of that work and the general makeup of the group that has signed on to it? And then if you could sort of talk us through why you think it's important to mobilize Christians in this moment.
Well, first, a big thank you, Ruthie and PRRI, for all this data. What I care most about is how it impacts the public narrative before this election and, of course, afterwards, because this isn't all going away after the election. Georgetown, we held a national summit on faith and democracy, and we had this statement that was released, and thousands have signed it, I'm told. And the drafting committee was strong Catholic scholars, Black church scholars, evangelical, Catholic, Orthodox. It was very, very broad. And so I'm hearing now that pastors, even some white evangelical pastors, are signing and preaching on this statement in their congregations. And so what you're doing here is giving real substance and data to what I'm finding all over the country, that there's a movement afoot. There's a movement afoot to resist what I call white Christian nationalism. And the dominionist theology is not new. Donald Trump didn't invent this. It goes way back to before our founding in this nation. And so I think there is a move. We're getting hundreds of people showing up at all these events, all in rural Wisconsin and rural Michigan and Ohio. And I'm finding people are really very focused on this. And for them, this isn't an election that's just a test of democracy. It's a test of faith, the integrity of faith. Christian nationalism is antithetical, as Robbie said, to pluralism. It's also antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. And those of us who are followers of Jesus are pointing out how, and the book is just text after text after text of what Jesus said and did that have to be brought into this election. And so I'm finding wherever the texts of Jesus are brought in, Christian nationalism loses. And so how do we create a narrative where, and the third test is the students I teach again yesterday at Georgetown. They're watching to see how religious leaders stand up or don't stand up to this racialized Christian nationalism. They're watching. And we have a call this afternoon. We're in 10 battleground states and we're Face United to Save Democracy. We're training poll chaplains to go to polling places where the right says they're going to have Trojan horses, their people infiltrating elections and monitors, even workers. And it's now dangerous to be at polling. We're training people in de-escalation and nonviolent tactics. So we're going to be in, and the polling places they're targeting are minority, low-income communities. That's what they're doing. So this is a time to stand up and speak out and even go to those polling places and to, in fact, we're seeing unarmed Black clergy confronting armed white men at polling places.
Wow. Well, I think maybe we can come back to some questions about the political violence questions, which I'd love to hear more about. But I first want to hear from Michael. So you recently wrote a great spotlight piece for PRRI, which I recommend all of our attendees to go read, about differences between Black and white supporters of Christian nationalist ideas. In the previous report on Christian nationalism, there's a really helpful explanation of the ways that white and Black supporters of Christian nationalism differ in terms of their other views, or what Christian nationalism kind of does, for people's other views. An important takeaway that you give is that Christianity appears to simply play a very different role in white and Black communities. And particularly, and here I'm quoting you, Black communities historically used Christianity to interpret and motivate responses to racial oppression and injustice in the United States. I increasingly hear white Christians resisting Christian nationalism drawing explicitly on this vision of Christianity. And sometimes after spending time studying this longer tradition of Black Christian thought. What do you see as the role of Black Christian leaders and communities in this resistance work today, perhaps in light of their support for some of the general ideas associated with Christian nationalism on their face?
Thanks, Ruthie, for the question, and to both you and PRI for this important conversation, and more specifically around the data that I find really useful in my own work. So in thinking about your question, the first thing I think that is important to say is that Black religious experience is multidimensional, that there are various streams and modes of belief systems that are operational within Black religion, both Christianity and other faiths. And one way to think about Black religious experience, at least in the context of Black Christianity, is through three belief systems. And here I'm kind of drawing from the work of Eric McDaniel at UT Austin. And so those three belief systems include the social gospel, the prosperity gospel, and Black liberation theology. The social gospel kind of emphasizes individual and social salvation, and that the Christian faith requires believers to work towards social justice and equality. It's a kind of form of religious progressivism that undergirded the civil rights movement led by King and others. The prosperity gospel, which bends more towards theological conservatism, emphasizes the faithfulness of God and bestows that material wealth and prosperity as a reward for one's faithfulness to God. And at least within the Black Christian tradition, you could see people like T.D. Jakes, Creflo Dollar, Eddie Long before he died as kind of figures that were associated with that. And then, the third system of belief, Black liberation theology, which essentially argues that God is a God who is on the side of the oppressed, who, at least in the context of the United States, have been largely Black people. And so, in other words, there are parallels between the experiences of Black people in the U.S. and Jesus and other critical figures. And there, James Cone is the towering figure for Black liberation theology. And so all of that is important in the context of this report, because as Melissa talked about in terms of who's actually the most resistant to Christian nationalism, the report indicates that Blacks are the least likely to resist Christian nationalist beliefs. And so for me, the question is, well, what beliefs are we actually talking about? If we're looking at the kind of metrics, the battery of questions that indicate or measures Christian nationalism, if we look at just one of them, for example, US law should be based on Christian values, well, one might interpret that in a particular type of way if you're interpreting Christianity through the Black social gospel or Black liberationist traditions, right? That emphasizes justice, that emphasizes, being just, doing justice, being merciful, right? Walking humbly with God. And so, for those who are interpreting Christianity in that particular light, they might walk away and have a different understanding of Christianity than those who see, particularly white Americans, who see Christian and white as kind of tethered up in a single identity. And this is, stuff that Philip Gorski, Sam Perry, PRRI, in its own report have talked about, right? And so there's a kind of fundamental difference in understanding Christianity that is at work when we think about Christian nationalism. And we can see the differences along ideology and political beliefs. So, for example, the report of the 2023 report talks about how 86% of Black Americans who qualify as Christian nationalists agree that white supremacy is still a major problem in the US. And we compare that to 64% of white Americans who also qualify as Christian nationalists who disagree that white supremacy is a major problem in the US. So here we see a fundamental difference between how Black and white Americans are viewing social issues in the United States, but both qualify as Christian nationalists. And we can look at some differences again in terms of views about Biden and Trump. 62% of Black Americans who qualify as Christian nationalists hold favorable views of Biden compared to 11% of